Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to today's episode of What's New in Data. Definitely super excited about our guests today. We have Ryan Janssen, CEO of Zenlytic. Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, John. Thank you so much for having me on the pod. Huge fan of both the pod and you and stream. So very excited to be here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. The admiration, likewise. Definitely a big fan of the work you're doing as well at Zenlytic, and also, your side quest, your side passion. I don't know if it was a one-time thing or something you're continuing to spend time on, but making DataMons of people in the industry. I have to tell this story. This is one of the highlights of my career working in this industry. This was at DBT Coalesce last year in San Diego. Ryan and the team at Zenlytic made what quote unquote DataMons, which are essentially Pokemon cards, but of people in the data industry. And it was such a delightful thing. Everyone loved it. I mean, there was Datamon for, all the people you can think of who frequently post about data on LinkedIn and Twitter and whatnot. And I just remember that just created a lot of like delight. And one of the things that made DBT Coalesce conference super fun this year. So Ryan, I have to ask you, like, what's the story behind creating those Datamon cards?
Oh, we had just as much fun creating Datamon as everyone had receiving the Datamons and sharing them. It was also one of the funnest things I've had a chance to do at my time at Zenlytic. Our goal with the Datamon was to highlight some of the capabilities of all the really neat stuff that you could do with AI. And that's exactly what it was, and, people don't even realize this, but those Datamon cards were, like, 99%, AI generated, so for those that don't know, it's a little card, it's like a collectible monster card or whatever, and there's a picture of the person, and there's some text with, like, abilities and powers and things like that. The way that the tool worked, and we built a small tool for this, is that people would come to the Zenlytic booth, and they would put in their LinkedIn profile. It would take their LinkedIn profile picture and use Midjourney to create the image. And it would also use an LLM to create the copy on the card. And those are actually linked together. So it was multimodal. So, there would be, a turtle related datamon would be like a turtley name and turtley skills and a turtley picture. And they were hilarious.
Yeah.
I was blown away by a few things. I mean, first, we were very surprised by how well they turned out ourselves. Just the quality of the copy and the images were all just kind of firing all cylinders. The other thing that really surprised me, and I think this is mission accomplished for like, highlighting all the neat stuff that can happen with AI, is, we were sitting in the booth and reflecting. And I remember thinking to myself, this would not have been possible at last year's Coalesce. This technology is moving so fast. Last year the image would have been like, some kind of weird stick figure with nine fingers, and like the copy would have been kind of disjointed, and it would have been written in GPT-3 before RLHF and things like that. Um, so it was literally impossible to do before the advent of this technology, and in less than a year between those two coalesces, it became possible. So we were really excited by the project. It was lots and lots of fun. And yeah, we're thinking about what's next too. I can't spoil anything yet, but we've got a pretty amazing whiteboard for next year's Coalesce. We're gonna do some more fun stuff with AI, I think.
Yeah, and you've really, it seems like you're really ahead of the curve in terms of turning AI into either data products that bring users delight, or also these fun conference novelties like Datamon. And I look at the actual product that Zenlytic is, and you phrase it as the business intelligence you can talk to, and it's really incredible how quickly your company has folded the latest innovations of AI into your customer facing product. So I'd also love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. The reason it feels like that happened quickly is because we started early. It's one of those usual, you hear the story of we're not I wouldn't say we're, an overnight success, but you hear these stories of real overnight successes like Instagram, and they're huge, and people forget the 6 years before that where they weren't huge. Our experience with AI started, many years before the revolution. Paul, my co-founder, and I, met when we were studying machine learning in 2018. And, when afterwards, when we set out to build Zenlytic, we'd always had some AI and ML functionality in the tool. It was neat, actually. Like the early versions before LLMs really started taking off used like the progenitors of GPTs. So before GPT, there's an algorithm called BERT, for instance. It's an open source model. It's much more rudimentary. They're much smaller. The quality's not there, but we had always been incorporating these sorts of techniques into the tool. I think, they say running a startup is just being one of the most important parts is being willing to be wrong for longer than anybody else. So, we had some basic functionality for a long, long time. Lucky for us, it got better faster than we expected. It just kind of happened overnight, and we were well placed to quickly jump on the capabilities of these new models. What that meant specifically was, first we could improve resolution. So like Bert, for instance, has a pretty hard time understanding the difference between last month and last complete month, for instance. You know, Nuances can trip it up. So you can improve performance and resolution significantly. The other neat thing that it unlocks is chat. I think about search versus chat. And before we had some of the more advanced, the really big LLMs in play in Zenlytic, it was a search. It was a single bar. You type something in, you get your answer. We were able to jump very quickly into what we call Zoe, which is our chatbot, and Zoe lets you actually refine and answer multiple questions. So if you ask an ambiguous question at the start, Zoe will correct you and say, "Wait, do you mean like what do you mean by top here?" If you want to drill in or refine or say, "Oh wait, no, I actually I meant this instead," you can do that in a chat. And I guess that's kind of that was a step change for me. I think that's really important. And that's what gets me really excited. But the journey started a long, long time ago. Yeah, with some pretty basic models.
Yeah, and speaking of models, we'll talk about different type of models. So the way you framed the usage of your product, the steps to success with Zenlytic, which is a business intelligence product with AI built in and semantic layers. But you talk about connecting to your warehouse as step one, step two, define the semantic layer, and step three, ask Zoe, like you mentioned, that's the chatbot, ask Zoe questions. So I want to get into the semantic layer part. So I would love your perspective on sort of the both the foundational aspect and sort of the latest and greatest parts of data modeling.
Yeah, for sure. And that's such an interesting way to phrase that question, because I think you cover an important sub question in there, which is like, is the semantic layer part of your data model? It's kind of like the age old question of like, should I do this in Looker or DBT? I I would answer yes. By the way, the semantic layer is part of the data model, and I would say that it's not a coincidence that we're seeing this resurgence in the community of these two concepts at the same time. We've seen semantic layers sort of steadily gaining momentum and popularity over the course of the last few years, led by a number of great tools. And at the same time, very recently, I feel like even just the last couple of months, people have been rediscovering data modeling. I think the interesting thing is that those are kind of two sides of the same coin, and you can't have a data model without due consideration for how that data will be consumed at the outset or by your end users. I think a big mistake that people make when they're thinking about how to build a data model is they start at the warehouse and go out, whereas I think they should probably start at the solution and go back. Let me give you an example. If you just want to, let's just say you're dumping your BigQuery into G Sheets and letting people play around with it, that's going to require a pretty different approach to data modeling than if you put a really effective semantic layer on and you're using a BI tool to make those queries live at query time. So, yeah, I guess one thing that I would really consider, when you're if you're interested in data modeling, ask yourself if it's time for a semantic layer. If you're considering a semantic layer, you should think about the data model that enables that.
Excellent. And there's not all data modeling requires semantic layers. There's a lot of
Yeah.
approaches to it. But when should teams start asking themselves, like, hey, should we start looking at the semantic layer?
I think so. I think you'll get different answers for that question depending on who you ask. I'm generally on the pro side, but let's look at the trade offs, right? So, the benefits of the semantic layer are they're incredibly helpful for a self serve experience, right? That's the first thing is that if you look at the history of how people consume data, if you're comfortable with SQL or Python or whatever, 20 years ago, you were probably querying a window that looked a lot like the Snowflake window. And today you're probably querying a window that looks a lot like Snowflake. Like things haven't really changed that much. On the non-technical side, 20 years ago, you were asking that other person. And now you're actually clicking around in a GUI and you're actually manipulating, individual fields in, a Looker window, for instance. That's changed a lot, and that's because of the semantic layer, right? That's one of the big pieces of technology that's advanced to unlock that self-serve experience. Another interesting part of the semantic layer, which there's a few of us that believe this, I think it's an essential component for good LLM performance. There's two philosophies for data chatbots. One is text to SQL, where the LLMs write SQL. The other is the semantic layer, where it's governed by the LLM. I'm very much in the latter camp because, well, it's governed for starters. If you ask a text to SQL chatbot about a metric that doesn't exist, they could try and invent a definition that hasn't been approved. And I don't think the accuracy for LLMs is there to generate SQL with the reliability level of a BI tool, anyways. So I think it's an essential part of the LLM experience. Now, the trade offs of the semantic layer, why wouldn't you use a semantic layer? And its complexity, its work, right? And that's one of the problems with the semantic layer. And I think it's actually an endemic problem in our industry that we're only kind of partially acknowledging is that building and maintaining these pipelines takes huge amounts of effort and time. You can have, 10,000 line YAMLs very easily in a semantic layer. And it can be multiple full-time jobs to maintain that. So I would say, to answer your question, the right markers for evaluating if you should be using a semantic layer or not are how the data is being consumed and sort of the size of your team and your resources. So if you have no data team, you're probably not ready for a semantic layer. If you have one or two people, yeah, maybe. It depends on how big and how comprehensive you want that semantic layer to be. Likewise, if you live in G Sheets, skip the semantic layer for now. But if you want to, or if you have more comprehensive data, things that you want to be able to dig deeper on, people want to drill and explore. If you're getting a lot of ad hoc requests, I think is a good indication. Those would be cases in favor of going for the semantic layer.
Yes, and the never ending stream of ad hoc requests. Hey, do we have a report for this? Do we have a report for that? Oh, I like this, but I just want to add one field to it. I think these are definitely symptoms of an organization that needs a semantic layer. And tying that back to your point about, yeah, if you don't have a data engineering team, or it's a super small, or you don't have the maturity yet to really maintain a semantic layer, then perhaps you're not ready. But at the same time, if you're getting all these questions from the business, you as a data leader are sort of tasked with qualifying the value of that. And if it turns out that answering those questions and being able to move swiftly with data has a lot of business value, then it's time to ask for that budget and staffing.
Yeah.
So, and that leads me to my next question for you, which is, how should data leaders actually go about implementing self-service analytics, both technically and then, getting the business buy-in as well?
Yeah, good question. Let me start my answer with that with an anecdote that straddles those two questions, which is you wouldn't believe how you've probably done this yourself, but I'm always astonished how effective it is if someone sends you an ad hoc question and you have a semantic layer native tool. Instead of just giving them a plot, you send them a link to an Explorer with the proper field selected, and you say, "Here you go." And then after that, the questions just stop. It's amazing. It's like that just settles it, and the person's, "Oh, I see. I can just click and change this," and they'll actually make the necessary changes. It's probably the most effective way of seeing self-serve in action. Now, on to how would you implement self-serve? I think there are we could get into people, processes, tools. I'd say generally on the tool side, the important things would be transformation, semantic layer, and some sort of BI. It doesn't have to be a boil the ocean BI or a boil the ocean semantic layer or a boil the ocean transformation layer, but those are essential pieces for a great self-serve experience. I think something that people fail to acknowledge today is that uh, a plurality, a solid majority of self-serve experiences are still start on a dashboard, explore from here. They're less often a de novo question where someone opens up, a blank self-serve page and starts selecting stuff. They usually start from a starting point. So that means you need dashboards and some sort of BI tool as a starting point. I would say in terms of philosophy, the most important thing when you're deploying these tools, and I guess this comes into both people and processes, I think people make the mistake of trying to do too much too fast. People try to boil the ocean. I think anytime anybody starts thinking that your self-serve deployment is a digital transformation, that's a big red flag, and that means you probably need to trim it down. Right?
I like that.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's all about starting small and iterating. You there's an inherent risk here, right? So like iteration is how you build good products. Data tools are products, but the difference between products and data tools is that your data tools can't really be wrong. Trust is a non-renewable resource, and if you start giving people bad quality data or inaccurate tools, then they're going to lose trust and stop using it. So you have a very delicate balance between actually iterating to improve the tools and starting small, adding new things and fixing things as you go, and just breaching the trust of your end users. So I think all along that iterative process, you need to be over communicative. You need to be very, very clear about where the weak points are. So you can say, we've added this new metric. I think this is correct, but please try it out and tell me if there's anything that you want to have changed. If you point out where there could be errors in data quality before they happen, you can maintain that trust and keep on iterating with that user. This is why I actually talk ad nauseum about the importance of soft skills. Everyone does, but I spent a bit of time as a consultant in a past life, and I have a lot of respect for the people who are really, really great at managing stakeholders, great communicators, and I think the data industry's sort of collective psyche is that we all understand that's really important, but I don't think we're doing enough yet. So I think
Mm.
the right way to do this, in summary, start small, iterate, and do a really this project will succeed on soft skills, not on really, really great SQL.
Yeah, 100% in agreement with you there. And I've said this before, but data teams are really the bridge between engineering and the business. The way I see it, at least the way we operate internally here at Stream. But I also see this across our customer base, where it's sort of like the the data is coming from your prod software systems, your microservices, your databases, your Salesforce, things along those lines, your whole tech stack, whatever it is, right? And then the data team's job is kind of curating that and creating insights from it. And yeah, I mean, you can view it as purely technical. Oh, we're moving data from this stuff into this warehouse and transforming it, blah blah blah. But the reality is that you're trying to distill these details to a level that, business users can understand it and actually action it. And that's the most critical thing, because you can build a ton of pipelines and go completely off the rails and build some outputs that are completely unusable. And then it's like, why even have a data team? You could just go directly to the source and pull a report from Salesforce to do a dump from your database, ad hoc when needed. But
Yeah.
the like you said, the soft skills are critical in terms of managing stakeholders and making sure that you understand them and their needs, so that your pipelines are providing value and can ultimately become, the magic word is operational. But there is a real path for that.
Yeah. That path is fascinating, by the way. You probably followed it all the way down, like I've seen happen a few times, where you start out where people are like, "Oh, it's a data team. That's neat." And then people start to take it seriously and, build trust in the data. And there's that strange inversion point when that data system becomes a system of record. And then suddenly it's a mission critical team and there's SLAs around that and there's pager duty for the data team and things like that. And it's, you could debate if that's the right approach or not, but it's, you definitely see that happen. And it's fascinating to see these teams come from, new initiative to essential.
Yeah, and it is definitely fascinating to see that. And but once it becomes essential, it's a really great sign. That's when the number of ad hoc requests goes through the
Mhm.
roof.
Yeah.
And you get more people asking you like, hey, are these numbers right? And you have your validation process to sort of prove it out. It's really a fun journey to see that evolve across the board. So one of the things
Yeah.
that's sort of accelerating this and has huge promise for data teams is AI. Now you've rolled out a product that's seamlessly integrated AI into the customer experience. So I'd love your perspective. You know, is data dependent on AI or vice versa? Or actually, why don't we back up a second? Uh, I want your perspective on AI for the data industry in general.
Yeah. Well, my perspective is not yet. Let me caveat it by saying my perspective has not yet been proven. So this is my belief, but the way that I think about this, and you hit the nail on the head, which is I think one of there's two I think big things that have held self-serve back. One is ambiguity in defining what self-serve is, which maybe we can put a pin in for later. The second one, which you just mentioned, is kind of the paradox of self-serve, which is the more access to data you can give someone, the more questions they can ask back. And that is the challenge of, how do you prevent self-serve from multiplying the number of requests instead of managing it? I think it's been a problem for 30 years, right? And I think every BI tool has set out with a punchy tagline like ours, the world's first self-serve BI tool. And they pat themselves in the back and they build this really nice, elegant UI. And then someone wants to be able to do native cohorting. And then somebody wants to be able to add a date spread in, and then somebody wants to be able to change the axis tick label color, and eventually you're like this overly complicated, airplane cockpit of tools that it's no longer self-serve. Data is inherently hard. It's a pinch point between a huge number of boundary cases in the data quality and structure, and a huge number of use cases and UI challenges with presenting it. My perspective, and again, I'm hopeful this is the case, that we'll continue to expand that through technology. I think we've seen things like semantic layers have pushed that farther, and they've gone further on the efficiency plane for that. I I firmly believe the next big step for that is AI for data, and it gives you the power to handle those use cases really really elegantly. And to give you an example, someone in Zenlytic wanted to change a line plot into a big number chart. Big number chart was grayed out, and they didn't realize they had to remove the date column for it before they did that. And then they were like, okay, well, I guess I could probably grog through the docs and figure that out, and kind of like okay, and like figure that out. But or you can just go into Zoe and say, make this a big number plot. all of those things are actually kind of encapsulated in that sentence, as long as we have what turns out to be an absolute beast of a model that can, encode the intent without having that over like huge amount of complexity. I so I actually I don't know if you have a car. I moved to Florida, so I had to get a car. I got a Tesla, and it's super duper cool. So it doesn't have a dashboard,
Uh-huh.
right? I make a BI tool. I have a car with no dashboard. All it has is this one big screen in the middle, and the relevant stuff when I'm turning it puts the camera on and things like that. So it presents the relevant information at the right time. And they're actually working to offload as much as possible, right? The new Teslas, they're taking out the tree stalks and putting that onto the little screen. And it's neat because it makes a very, very streamlined experience. And I think that LLMs can do that for complicated tools, not just in the data industry. And, our example of that is in the dashboard. We've actually stripped out all those crazy controls that you have to learn how to manipulate in a BI tool. There's all these access tick labels, things and stuff like that. It's a big box. And you ask Zoe and you say, hey, Zoe, can you make this into, just make these first three into bars and, put horizontal line at 0 and give it a color scheme that looks like it's from the 1970s, whatever. And then you can do all those things without having to know how to manipulate all those little edge cases. So, long story short, I think that AI and in particular LLMs are going to be an effective tool for widening that pinch point between those edge cases.
Yeah, and every data team is sort of evaluating, what role AI is going to play in their organization. I've spoken to data engineers at companies of all sizes that are trying to see, like, okay, for one, is this our charter or not, or is there going to be another group that's going to be, under a chief AI officer, and they're going to make all the calls, or is this something that's sort of incremental for our data team to, hey, we're using this data warehouse, it's adding a vector extension and vector search. Is that our AI strategy? And there's all this choice, which is great. And I think that's why everything's going to move so fast this year. Like you said, like 2 years ago, those DataMon cards weren't possible. Now, going forward, AI is going to just be a huge game changer in data products as well. And you might find that if you don't have a good solution in place by 2025, then people might ask questions like, hey, are we missing the ball here?
Yeah, for sure. I think everyone feels some anxiety around that. I would say one other interesting take that might alleviate some of that anxiety too, which is I think that an AI strategy is not going to be like one giant boulder you drop into somewhere. I think it's going to be finding a lot of small things that can improve the experience. And the good news is that's a lot of that is going to get thrown over to the tool builders and the vendors. And I think about that thing that MotherDuck just added. It's just a little SQL fixer. And all it is, when you're in a query, it's called fix it, I think. And if there's an error, it'll find it and say, propose a solution. So you can click it instead of having to, make sure you have the right syntax and fix your SQL. It's just, little stuff like that. I think we're going to find a lot of just nice little things. They're going to add up to a very different experience.
Yeah. I think, like you said, the little victories here and there can sort of snowball into this bigger effect. So yeah, I love the example of what Mother Duck rolled out. That team did a good job of just kind of, rather than trying to boil the, like, using your terminology, boil the ocean with AI. They're like, okay, what's a quick little thing that we can add into our product that'll delight users and is relatively straightforward and in some ways pretty limited in scope, but maximizing the user's positive experience with the product. So yeah, I think teams will have to kind of evaluate what that means for them, what they can roll out. That's sort of like a minimum viable product of AI driven delight. And then just keep building from there. Now, I think that's a great strategy.
Solutions for problems, right? So it's like, I think actually one big thing we'll see in 2024, 2023 was the year of wonder with this technology, right? And that led to all of the fun, prompt writing guides and chat with the PDF apps and like Monty Hall problems and whatever, right? People evaluating these tools, and there's like just a bunch of really hypey stuff. But I think a lot of that is calming down now, because those are tools just like building your semantic layer. They start with the tech first, and then they're like, okay, what can we solve with this? I think you're going to find the most effective tools are going to be like what Methodic is doing. It's like there's a problem. People don't want to have to write all the SQL. So can we solve this using these new tools? And I think the real winners are going to start with the problem and find a solution for it.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Now, there's also the category of companies where, they sort of have to move in certain ways, buy in, investment, really understand what's being developed, have a multi-year roadmap, a lot of compliance and control that they have to get into the process. Because it is possible that, depending on the size of your company, that these sort of kind of small incremental adoptions might not work because it doesn't have the right sort of buy-in internally, in which case, ultimately, even though you tried to be as nimble and agile as possible, it was still all for naught given the way things are rolled out. So what are your recommendations to companies that have to have more of a longer term view on it?
Well, my first reaction is I believe that AI is here to stay. That sounds like maybe it sounds like a silly thing to say because it feels like it's so hot, but we have these every few years there's something, right? And like 3 years ago everyone was figuring out their whatever ICO strategy, and like there's always something, or a lot of those things are not really sustained, right? And it's like people worry about how they're going to launch their own whatever digital wallet, and then it turns out that no one's using digital wallets 5 years later, and they abandon the project. So a lot of these technologies, are just flashes in the pan, or they take several sort of swings to really get off the ground. I think that we are seeing value delivered by AI at a scale that's order or orders of magnitude higher than what I would, one of these false waves. So, I mean, the first thing is I would, start now. I wouldn't, like hedge on it. I wouldn't say, is this going to be important for us or not? So I think that's a good first step. I think a good second step, do your compliance research. So understand what your targets are for the company. There, we have work with companies with a large variety of appetites, from people who have their own, on-prem enterprise GPT-4 contracts, through the people using open source models, through the people using external APIs. So I think it's worthwhile having that conversation and understanding it. I think it's worthwhile having a reasonable conversation about that. It's a little bit scary to do now because we're still testing the boundaries of, like the compliance, societal, like even legal boundaries of what these models can and can't do. Another sort of universal truth of these waves, though, is, things that seem like they're a stretch for the appetite now usually tend to become normal in a few years' time. So it feels a bit like when Amazon first launched and people were aghast that they would put a credit card on the internet. So I would say certainly don't be like imprudent or anything, but have a rational conversation about what you want to make sure that you protect in terms of compliance. And then also I think in general a really good way to start. I'm unfortunately biased in this regard, but I fall on generally on the buy and the build versus buy side of this, at least to get started. We have users who are using our embedded product that want to build this themselves, and I certainly would celebrate when they do. But it's tough tech to work with. It's deceptively hard to work with. It's the kind of thing where you can go and build a GPT in 15 minutes in a toy example in a very small scale, and you're like, I'm a genius. Look at this. I'm making AI. I'm an AI engineer. And then you realize that one of the weak points of LLMs is it's very difficult for them to work at scale. and it's very difficult for them to work predictably. And the level of work to go from that toy example to scalable and predictable is a very steep curve. I would say that I think there's a case to be made for both. And again, I'm admittedly biased, but I fall on the start sooner and buy, focus on the compliance aspects,
Mhm.
buy with vendors that you trust, buy with vendors that can show you that they are doing the necessary steps, that they are also compliant. Yeah, but I would say that's probably the fastest way to get started. As someone who's
Absolutely.
been
Yeah.
fidgeting with this stuff for a year now, trust me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you've had great success actually implementing this initiative. So it's great for people to get your take on it. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, we talked about data modeling, we talked about AI, we talked about self-serve analytics, and even datamon cards, all that stuff. But one of the core things this always comes back to is like, how will people actually use your product, right? Whatever you're
Mm,
working on. So and data teams need to think the same way. So like,
yeah.
what are the best, and we also talked about the soft skills required, things along those lines. But what are the best ways for data teams to actually model their data with the end user in mind?
Yeah, great question. I would say that there are so first there's two philosophies that are the most popular, I think, right now. The first would be some sort of star schema with a semantic layer. And this actually wasn't even possible a couple of years ago, even for instance. So before dbt bot transform, the original dbt's semantic layer did not support table joins, right? So the star schema was not possible. Now, every modern semantic layer will do that. So that's one approach. The other approach I would say is I'd say the conventional classic approach that's been going pre-semantic layer evolution is kind of the one big table, OBT. There's trade-offs to both. You begin with the end in mind. You have to understand how users will consume that data, and that looks very different in those two examples. And it depends on what they feel comfortable with. When you're using a semantic layer, you're thinking in terms of metrics and dimensions, and you're thinking in terms of when you have one big table, you're thinking in terms of a spreadsheet, right? So then people have a giant CSV basically. Those are both good. There's trade-offs. Some people prefer one or the other. I would say I'd say it's a slightly higher learning curve to go and choose those fields and dimensions. I would also say that once you get to learn to think in terms of those metrics, it becomes very intuitive and much more powerful for navigating the underlying data. And this comes back to how you define self-serve. If self-serve, there's a spectrum. It could be static dashboard consumption. Somewhere in the middle is using, GUI Explorer type tools to point and click. And then over here is sort of, citizen data scientists or running experimentation, things like that. And one big table is pretty good for taking someone to dashboard, but it's not very good for taking someone to sort of level 2 or level 3. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, again, it's like what do you want to do with self-serve? And if you think those static or kind of sliceable reports or slightly sliceable reports are enough, yeah, one big table will be simple and fast. If you want to dig deeper, I go with a semantic layer and a star schema.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the guidance, Ryan. Thank you for being generous with your insights there with the audience. Where can people follow along with your work, Ryan?
I would say probably LinkedIn's best. Just Ryan Janssen. Honestly, you can't miss me.
Mhm.
I'm on Twitter too, less active on Twitter, but it's at Ryan Janssen. Or you can go to our website and just hit the contact us button. It goes to me. It's zenlytic.com.
Excellent. Ryan Janssen, CEO of Zenlytic, business intelligence you can talk to, the first truly self-service BI platform in your words, but I'm a believer. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you for joining today's episode of What's New in Data, and thank you to the audience for tuning in.
Thanks so much, John.